For he himself knows whereof we are made. He remembers that we are but dust. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts always be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. You may be seated. I heard a story about this woman, Candy Chang. In 2009, Candy Chang lost a friend very suddenly. She had a friend named Joan who had become a mentor and a mother figure to her, and she died quite quickly and unexpectedly. And when this happened, Candy found herself in a terrible depression and just grieving, and she couldn't break out of the funk that there was in grieving for her lost friend and the depression and darkness that followed. And so, since she was an artist, she decided she would make some art, just like some of us, when we've been in times of depression and grief, decide that the best way out of it is just to do what we do every day. We go to work, and Candy decided that she was going to go back to work. And the kind of art that Candy made is this big art in public places. She would paint on whole sides of buildings, or she would transform abandoned buildings in different parts of cities for them to beautify them. Knowing that the building was worthless for habitation any longer, she would do something with it other than just knock it down and leave an empty lot. And in 2009, when she lost her friend Joan, Candy happened to be living in the city of New Orleans, which since the summer of 2006 had been a place full of empty buildings after this rather nasty lady Katrina came through town. And so Candy found this house that was in the neighborhood she lived in. It was completely uninhabitable. And she decided that she was going to turn this into some kind of art project that would deal with the grief and depression she was experiencing from the loss of her friend Joan. So she went through all the proper paperwork. She got all the right permits pulled, and she got her concept down. And Candy started to paint on the street-facing side of this house. And what she painted was a giant chalkboard. And when she finished painting the chalkboard, she made a little stencil. And the stencil said this, and she started painting it all over the board, as though it was in a schoolroom, very evenly spaced and in straight lines, like somebody had to do some after-school writing of lines. Maybe you had to do this in elementary school. I did on the board. She did this up there. And all it said on the stencil was, "Before I die, I want to," and then left a blank. And she did this, and as she's painting the chalkboard, people are very curious what's going on in their neighborhood. Just as you can imagine, if somebody found an empty house here in Richland Center that was on a busy walkway, that you would wonder what they were doing when they're painting it. And then when she started to put this up on the wall, she actually already had a bucket of chalk out there with her for people to fill in the blanks. And she said she never imagined this would happen. People were filling these in as fast as she could put them up on the chalkboard. And in fact, she said the first person that did it was this fella that they'd all seen around the neighborhood wearing a pirate hat. And because it's New Orleans, of course, he wore his pirate garb everywhere. And one of the very first things written on the wall was, "Before I die, I want to be on trial for piracy," is what this fella had written. But as the day went on, as she kept filling in, they kept filling in the slots, and actually 24 hours after she had done this, much to her surprise, she had no idea how people would react to having a big chalkboard, a chalkboard that was 12 feet high and 30 feet long in the neighborhood that said, "Before I die, I want to," all over it. This is pretty aggressive. This is not something you want to be reminded of when you're walking to the grocery store, that you're going to die. But she said within 24 hours, there was no empty space on this, because everybody who walked by it and stood in front of it felt compelled to fill in the blanks. And when the blanks were filled in, they went to find any empty space, and they wrote vertically and they wrote diagonally so that they could get their items on there about what they wanted to do before they die. And in their first 24 hours, people wrote things like this on that wall. One person wrote that they wanted to straddle the international date line. Another person wrote they wanted to eat more of everything. Another person wrote that they wanted to swim without holding my nose. A person wrote, on this swimming theme, swim in a pool with golden retriever puppies. Another person wrote, before I die, I want to live in Paris and eat croissants. And another person wrote, before I die, I want to abandon all insecurities. Now, if the response to the wall she made that day was really surprising to her, actually. In fact, I think she thought she would get more pushback from the neighborhood that there was such a monument to death right in the middle of where everybody lived and worked and went for walks with their children. But they didn't. They all came and they all took chalk out of the bucket and they all stood in front of it and they all thought, some for a little while, some for a long while, and they all wrote something on it. And so out of her surprise, she does what we all do when we make something we like in this world. She took some pictures of it and she posted them online. And she said within weeks, her email box was full of people in other cities around the world wanting to know how they could get one of these walls in their own community as well. And since her first wall that she installed in New Orleans, about 5 years ago now when it was complete, there have been more than 1,000 of these walls installed in communities all around the globe. And there are new ones going up virtually every month. And I can tell you, you can go see the photos of them online. Virtually all of them are full of people writing down what it is they want to do or they want to be before they die. 1,000 walls in communities everywhere that make people deal and confront the one thing that we all are assured of experiencing: death. Now that seems counterintuitive to me, the way that we often react to the topic of death. We often react to the topic of death as though we're not actually allowed to talk about it. It is one of the most taboo topics in our culture. In fact, people joke that you can't talk about politics or religion at like the dinner table. You try to talk about dying the next time at Thanksgiving and see how that gets received. We don't talk about death because we think that the only things that talking about death reminds us of are regret and grief and anxiety and worry and loss. But that's not what happened when Candy put these walls up. And this was actually surprising to her as well, because she built the wall to deal with her grief. She thought, what I'm going to do is share the grief that I'm currently experiencing with the people around me, and I'm going to allow them to share their grief. And that's not what people did. Confronted with that wall where they had to choose what they wanted to do before they died, made them think about the present. It made them think about the things that they actually wanted to do, not the things that they wanted to wallow in, and not the things they wanted to avoid, or not the things that they thought they would miss out on. It focused for them their thoughts on the things that they found to be most important. Well, I would argue that what we get to do today in this place, when we take ashes around and put them on your heads, is a liturgical moment built just around such the same idea that Candy seemed to have, which is this service is a wall where we stand in front of it. And one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, before I die, I want to. And we don't ask that so that we can think of all the things that we're ashamed of, or all the things that we regret, or all the things we wish had never happened. But we do it in response to figure out what it is we do want to do, but more importantly, what is important to us. You know, the service we're at tonight is not one that every church has anymore, and part of it is this taboo of death. In fact, every year around Ash Wednesday, there are articles and debates that go on in different religious and theological outlets about whether we should even have a service like this where we remember death, or whether children should be at it. But I would argue if we don't face this moment, if we don't stand in front of that wall, and if we don't start to think about how we fill that in, we continue to be caught up just in the day-to-day anxieties of life, in the busyness of how we're going to get from breakfast to lunch to dinner, instead of being able to pull ourselves back and look at the world in this moment that in some ways defines us, that our life will come to an end, and figure out what it is about this life that is really important to us. Whether that thing be straddling the international date line, or as another person said, babysit their grandkids. Those things that are most important, this liturgical moment gives us a chance to express it. Because if we can't talk about death in a church, which is actually the place we most certainly should, we can't really talk about it anywhere. And if we ignore that fact about ourselves, we're going to have a hard time focusing in on the big picture, and we'll be caught up in everyday strife and anxiety. The other thing that happened with these walls that is so surprising, and what we do today too, is that Candy, it reminded her, though she didn't expect this, that the whole world realizes when they write on that wall and they see the chalk filling it, they are not alone in that moment of death. And in just a few minutes, you're going to get that experience as well, where that you will get to look around the room, and ironically, you won't be able to see what's on your own forehead, but there will be something like chalk on everybody's forehead, and it will be there to remind you that you're not alone. And when you come and sit at this rail and have the ashes rubbed on your forehead, there will be somebody right next to you. And there will be somebody with that mark already on their forehead looking down at you. Because one of the things that we most fear about that moment of death is that we are alone. But actually, it is the thing we are least alone in. And also, I imagine, when people who saw these pictures of Candy's wall that she had posted on the internet wanted to build one in their own town, and they went to pull permits, and they were trying to get all of the pieces in place to build these things, there were lots of arguments about where to put this. Because it is not a joke that people don't like to be confronted with death. And it's not an accident that we do this liturgical moment. If we've forgotten all year to remind ourselves about our mortality, we do it right now. And that is because in our wall, our ashes on the forehead moment, we have something that those walls don't have, which is that we do this now because we are preparing to be reminded that in the work of Jesus Christ, what death means is different. Because even though we are all headed to dust, that is not our final destination. Our final destination is glory, though through dust. And because of what Jesus was able to do on the cross, and because of the way he was able to be raised again by the Father on Easter Sunday morning, we think differently about this moment. Even though the death focuses on what is important, and even though it reminds us that we're not alone, it also prepares us to accept the glory that God has prepared for us. Because we don't do these ashes in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the year sometime when we're not preparing for something. If we did that, that would be a downer. But we do it right now because we know we are only preparing to be resurrected on Easter Sunday morning. we have picked the appropriate place to do it. Not when it will leave us in despair, but when it will put us in the best position to be raised again. Because there is only one prerequisite for resurrection, and that's death. And that's what Jesus has done for us. He has turned that moment of meaninglessness and that destiny of only going back to the earth into something becomes the transition moment for our glory. So before you die, you want to what? And is it something that you're prepared to say when you are raised again, that's what I did with myself? Do you want to say I was busy? Or do you want to say, I found what was important and I focused on that? I found Jesus, who was important, and I focused on that. Because dust is not the final place we will rest. We will finally rest in God's glory because of Jesus Christ.